This week, it's API security. In the new segment, Linux kernels have a sack of patches. Osquery gets selected, the dangers and designs of DevOps, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 66, recorded June 24th, 2019. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hey, Matt.
Hey, I'm back.
You're back. We've missed you. And also John Kinsella, who once again is on the road. Hey, John.
Hey, guys. How you doing? Good to be here.
Register for our upcoming webcasts with Domain Tools, SaltStack, Viavi, and IC2 by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find our on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Security Weekly is returning to Vegas this August for Black Hat and DEF CON. If you would like to request a briefing or sponsor an interview on site at Black Hat, please go to securityweekly.com/booking and submit your request. So guys, this week I thought we'd start off with our news segment. And the news, once again, I think we always pull in browsers as they are a bit of a good topic for anything around application and web applications security. But there's also some other breaches and to talk about as well. I think I'll just dive in real quick on the brief comment about Mozilla, who pushed out a pretty critical a patch for a critical vulnerability that was basically exploitable via JavaScript. And this is interesting, I think a little bit more so just kind of shining the light that JavaScript is a tough language to harden in terms of the engine that's running it in the interpreter. So pretty much anytime you have a crash that you can cause via JavaScript in the browser, you almost have to assume that it's going to become some type of RCE. And in this case, in fact, it was rated critical not only because of how it could be exploited, but there was also evidence of active exploitation around some phishing campaigns. So pretty interesting, as well as the public service announcement for the day: patch your browsers.
And limit your JavaScript? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You know, I was just thinking the thing is, like, so yeah, personally, I can't stand JavaScript, especially server side. You know, so one of the things I'm working on, one little side projects right now is I want, when I have an idea for, something I want to code up, like, a quick web service and maybe like a front end. Every time I do that, I have to go back through and get the right version of Go, get my microservices set up, my imports, then go pick up a React stack, and then blah, 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 blah. So I'm creating a framework, then go about on GitHub that, like, this is my base starting point, right? So then all I have to do is drop some Go code in and some JavaScript, and I get to actually play with what I want to do, not the application and the framework. But just thinking through, the reason I'm saying that there in that backstory is JavaScript's not going away. It's really simple if you want to hack and get something out quickly, especially on the front end side. And I understand why it's so popular with so many people to use a node in different locations. But at the same time, we've got this thing which got a very flat learning curve. People like using it because as you make changes, you see it in your browser instantly, right? That's a way a lot of us learn. But at the same time, it seems like at some point we have to do something with this language. And, the first thought in my head there as you're asking Matt was, maybe do we start doing a rewrite from scratch, improve the spec? Or are we just going to have to deal with this for like another version of Flash for the next 10 more years. It's I don't know. I'd love to see some way of improving this from like a not just a sort of push the ball down the road or push the bits over out of the way, but how can you actually do something significant to make this a secure, mature language?
Yeah, because
Yeah,
what's the
Microsoft.
alternative? Flash or Java runtime engine, right? I mean, we already know the challenges with both of those. Maybe it's React and leveraging more of what React can do to help put some safeguards in place. But I think you're right, John. JavaScript's not going anywhere anytime soon.
I mean,
Yeah,
maybe
Microsoft's been doing some with TypeScript. So, and
yeah.
it's that idea of like what can we actually write in a different language that compiles down into JavaScript, so that we can put some better controls, better tooling around how the software is written, so that the JavaScript we can kind of ignore it. Because if we want to go even crazier here, I don't know how much you guys have been following the WebAssembly, but that's
Hmm.
almost in a way just another nightmare waiting to happen in the sense of basically JavaScript turning into essentially a state, bytecode state machine in the browser. And there's, additional security considerations there, but it's kind of just abstracting the JavaScript into other languages. And it seems like that's the way to go rather than trying to reinvent the wheel poorly.
I forgot about TypeScript, and that's actually a really good point. So maybe since I'm still building out this framework, maybe I'll go back and look at that. So what I'm doing, just for folks thinking, is I'm like, okay, well, I want a Java backend. I want to be able to connect to a database. So I'll have like a Docker Compose file in there with like a database up and running, so I can do some R&D. Let's see, I'm thinking about playing with GraphQL, then like I said, React, and then like maybe some other sort of common popular libraries in the front end. But maybe, hey, I'll take a step back and actually use this as an excuse to look at TypeScript and use that as language too.
Yeah, that might be worth it because one of the things we haven't really dived into a lot of different programming language discussions because to a degree, you can mess up in pretty much all of the languages, and I'll take that because even Mozilla they've been pushing a lot of from their C backend into Rust and Python. Which also uses a segue into Netflix. So Netflix reported 3 vulnerabilities in the Linux kernel that were pretty elegant. They're around the TCP selective acknowledgement, which essentially is a way to make the network layer and TCP retransmission in case packets get dropped. It's a way to make it more efficient. And so there's a theme here in the sense of efficiency can become more complex and it's become more rife with errors. If we think about, at the hardware level, how hyperthreading and all of the hardware problems that we've seen in the past due to optimizations and trying to make software more efficient. But in this case, I actually wanted to highlight it less about the bug itself, but more about it is Red Hat's explanation in particular is a really nice and simple write-up about what this function, what this algorithm is trying to do, and why it went off the rails in the sense of just a very classic integer overflow in C. So this Linux kernel is written in C, and it just kind of points to, that is a creaky language that gets lambasted for many reasons for good, other reasons for, not so good in the sense there is, we can write secure C if we take the time to it, but that's maybe not the best way we want to invest our time. So maybe it's time for at least not JavaScript in the kernel. Nobody's proposed that yet, but we'll see what happens when we get there. And the third thing. Oh, go ahead.
I just thought on this one. So I didn't look at this in detail. I'm presuming this affects a pretty good number of versions of the Linux kernel.
Yeah. So it was.
Well, where I was going is it's interesting. It's the amount of how lucky we get when you have something like this, which is a fairly significant looking, ability to DOS a box, that we don't get this more widespread in attacks, or at least not my radar. So I'm not sure if that's a combination of luck or firewalls are doing some amount of good, but it's we're lucky on a lot of these, I think.
Yeah, it is definitely one of those things. It was definitely critical and important to fix just from the availability part of that CIA triad. So it was leading to DOS, but the patch itself is pretty straightforward. And it's a pretty neat lesson just to read code to see what does a vuln look like in C and what does it look like to fix it, dealing with different variables that are expecting 8 bits, dealing with 40 bits into 32-bit integers or 64-bit integers. And there's just some really cool math. And and the other thing that I wanted to highlight it, for as much as we make fun of C, the code around this area within the kernel is a good example of very strong documentation. So it's clear, concise, and explains what the code is supposed to do, and then has the code hopefully implemented to match that design. So it's just another cool example of code to read and learn from, rather than just point fingers at and say, "Yep, there's another bug."
I wonder, you gave me an idea there, and maybe one of you guys know, have you heard of any colleges out there, universities, or any type of school doing sort of case study type work, the way, say a law school would around, well, obviously cases, but around vulnerability mitigation and discovery and patching? Because that seems like, that'd be an interesting class to teach people and like have them actually go, okay, this was the bug and how it was fixed. If any of our listeners are doing anything like that or aware of it, I'd love to hear about that. That'd be sort of fun to talk about on here.
Yeah, that would be neat. And I know that like I can't think off the top of my head, but the universities that are contributing to LLVM, for example, I know they're doing a lot of work into analyzing compilers and how compilers can either detect these types of issues or create sanitizers around them. But that is very much in the C++ environment. I don't know when we get into more like Python and even Go, for that matter, whether there's that type of research. But that would be really curious to see. So yeah, please, if you've got something out there, let us know. I'd be curious. I think too, in terms of lessons learned, the brief comment about this healthcare company that was compromised and now is going into Chapter 11. And you highlighted this, John. I'm pretty sure Matt's going to have some opinions here too.
Yeah, so this is back to the parent company over, and go forget their name.
Was it Quest
AMCA. Yeah, so AMCA is the parent company over the bill collector that was their top 4 customers were Quest, Diagnostic, LabCorp, and 1 or 2 others. So they got popped. It got announced a few weeks ago. But so it's interesting on a few different cases here. The first one was just, okay, well, these guys, so they filed Chapter 11. And it sounds like they've laid off most of their employees. And, unfortunately, the company's going to go. Sounds like they're not going to just restructure. It sounds like the company's going to go under. But okay, well, now all these patients who've got some amount of data out there that's been out in the public, are they going to get a type of, compensation or anything out of this, or are they just left holding, their data's on yet another database out there? And so we're thinking through this, and it's, what happens with these guys? It's okay. It's bad that the company closed down, and that's sort of unfortunate. But at the same time, what happens with the end users? And then the second thing around this, part of how, as you look through this article that we had on this, part of what actually got the company to this point, they had so little either logging or any type of security infrastructure that they literally didn't know. They knew they'd been compromised, but they didn't know how far it had gone, what data had been taken. So they had to assume the worst case, which was all their customers had been compromised. So now no one really knows whose data was taken or not. But at the end of the day, that means the parent company is going to have to shut down because they just didn't have the logging infrastructure in place. So multiple stories there of ways for people to improve what they're doing, and good reasons to do it, right? Usually we say you need logging so you can catch the person or what's going on, but being able to say, hey, minimize the scope of the investigation and what's going on and what actually happened here, and maybe you'll be able to save your company too.
This is a really good case of talking about risk management. Look, at the end of the day, security is a risk discussion. The board, the executives all have to decide how they're going to protect their environment, protect their customer data, and move forward. And look, we've seen lots of breaches, none of them really resulting in huge financial impacts or going out of business. And this is a case where we actually see it. This one will be interesting for me to cover maybe on the other show of what happens when the right risk discussions at the executive board level are not happening, and the potential results of what happens when you get breached and lose all your customer data and you literally go out of business. We haven't seen anything this drastic. Most of the times for a public company, 6 months later, their stock price is right back where it was. Maybe a couple executives got fired, but they're still in business and they're still making money. This is the exception, and it will be interesting to dig in a little deeper on this one.
Yeah, and that's a great point to see why, what made this exceptional, and was this literally also just a business decision as part of that risk, or was it more technical? That is, that the network and the application stack here was unsalvageable, so you might as well salt the earth and burn it all down and build up something new from scratch. I think too, to John's point, logging, that is, on our DevOps and DevSecOps theme, that ties into Osquery, because Osquery came out of Facebook, and is essentially a tool to be able to run essentially select-like commands across any host, across multiple hosts throughout your environment. And it's similar to, it has very strong logging and forensic incident response capabilities, similar to Google has their GRR, Google Rapid Response, their own open source tool that does similar data collection. And in this case, Osquery has gone out of just Facebook's pure creation into an open source project several years ago. And now the Linux Foundation is investing into it as a premier open source tool. So I think that's a good thing if we're taking the angle here and talking about breaches, for being able to have not only application layer logging, but being able to log just what's going on with your servers.
Yeah, well, I've seen a lot of it. Oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, no, I insist. Go ahead.
There's been a lot of adoption of Osquery, right? Originally Linux focused, and they added some support for Windows. People saw this as a way to distribute across their infrastructure and be able to get data. There are some challenges with the open source version. There's commercial variants like Upticks and others that have tried to build some more robust commercial features around Osquery, more from a deployment, scalability, centralization of data. But you've seen a lot of activity in this. So I think this is really interesting to see where the Linux Foundation can take this, right? What additional things come into this project that maybe the commercial guys have already done, or maybe not. It'll be really interesting to see what happens to some of the commercial players that have tried to build a lot of additional functionality on top of Osquery. Does Osquery get some of this natively by being a premier project within the Linux Foundation?
Yeah, and that's always that interesting line to walk for these open source tools, is how much can they get support for just from within the industry, and then how much of it should be that sort of service, like paid for services on top of it, or premium services, either going into less common infrastructure or environments that there's not enough just open source developers to go for, or addressing particular pain points, whether it is on that deployment and management. Especially too, it's great to have something like Osquery, but it also is going to create tons and tons of data. So just being able to analyze and store that data is also an expensive prospect.
Yep. So, and it's funny you tied to for some reason, the way I think of these two in my head is, and I know they're not related, so I don't need hate mail, but Osquery and Graphius from Google. And so it's been really interesting for me to watch Osquery over the last several years, because usually it always show up in whispers with, not like dark whispers, but it'd be mentioned by someone who usually really knew their stuff. And they had been looking for a tool, and they tracked something like this down, because it didn't get a ton of attention, right? It's, as Matt said, there was a few startups using it in different projects, but it hasn't been like, top level projects. So it's really interesting to see it get picked up by Linux Foundation. But sort of same thing with Graphius. It's been around for what I want to say around 3 years now, and I think they're both sort of slowly growing and getting building up momentum and interest without having that huge amount of marketing behind them initially. It's actually solid interest. So yeah, I'm pretty stoked to see them get picked up and looking forward to see where that goes.
Yeah, and I'm sure all the poor on the ops side of things, all those poor DevOps as system administrators, I will always be curious just how many more agents can they tolerate having to run on their systems, or how many processes running to monitor their systems. So
Yeah, and this is the other challenge, though, in my opinion, with OS queries. When we move into serverless infrastructure, how is this going to run? Are we going to allow a bunch of privileged containers run an OS query now in the environment to pull some of this data? Things get a little more interesting when we move into pure play platforms in serverless infrastructure. How OS query doesn't really have a place there. And so it gets, these are the things that what's going to replace some of the capabilities OS query has when there's no server to query anymore.
yeah, that's a great point. And the highlight there, I think, is that aspect of there's clearly a need for that capability, but the implementation of that is, who knows how that's going to evolve? Because it's one thing to say, hey, here is a pattern, here is a process that's running, and the binary has been deleted off a system. Or here is, OS query enumerating all of the execve forks that are happening on a system. Just knowing that information can be pretty rich in terms of finding anomalies, finding compromises. But what does that actually mean for serverless? And sure, it's great to have the capability, but if these cloud native tools are actually going to start building that capability in, maybe OS query is going to be a good competitor there and move that type of capability forward. Or there's going to be a lot of maybe just going to go into niche areas, and it's not going to hit the sweet spot that everyone needs in more modern environments even.
Yeah, because where I see this overlap gets really interesting with the container security guys that are pulling, system process level stuff, John, as well as what some of the APMs are doing when it comes to monitoring the performance of the application to know what's going on with app performance metrics, which are things that you could potentially pull from OS query at a box level. Right now I can pull it at the app level. So these things are all going to start to come intertwined. Who survives the technology transition over the next few years as we move to more platform type services where we're abstracting away not only the network, but the underlying server infrastructure as well. That's where I think the container and some of the app guys have a better leg up potentially for the long haul in the future. So that's where I want to see how some of the stuff plays out in the long run.
Yeah, I sort of agree with you on that. I mean, I think as much as I'm happy at a command line and having access to a server doing all that stuff. It's sort of baggage that gets in the way because it comes back to a standard thing. A developer wants to get their application out there. They don't want to run a server. So I don't know. There's value in the data there. How do we get it? If it's in containers, I happen to think I have a pretty good way of doing that. If it's in serverless, there's a few different ways of doing that. We're thinking about. I'm not going to say too much there, but what's interesting to me is if you look at this as becoming part of Linux Foundation, Linux Foundation also runs CNCF. So maybe those guys have something on their mind. They didn't just pick this up for giggles. They've actually got thoughts about how these two pieces will work together in a longer term. Maybe
is something to augment what Cilium's doing on eBPF potentially, or other projects. Sysdig's got some stuff I think sitting in Linux Foundation as well with some of their open source stuff. So there's potentially a few different other adjacencies in both the Linux Foundation and Cloud Native Computing Foundation that this might augment for some tools for the future. That's assuming the cloud guys don't do it all themselves anyways.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I was going to expand the conversation a bit too, because I think we can pull in this article. It's a little bit old. It's from December 2018 from GitHub about 6 DevOps pitfalls. But one of the things they talk about is like only doing a partial org transformation, doing too much too fast, and tool integration problems. And I think those 3 points possibly tie into what you guys were just talking about now, in the sense of is Osquery the right tool? Or if we just pull Osquery in because everyone else is using it, was that even smart? And quote unquote, are we DevOps now from collecting data? Or can we do this with other tools within our CI/CD pipeline? So it's that idea of just writing code and releasing fast doesn't mean you're agile or DevOps, nor does just saying we're going to do this particular tool change just because everybody else does means that you're actually a DevOps. So this was some things to avoid that I thought were pretty interesting. I think these items still hold up. It's only been 6 months, but they're possibly going to be pretty universal for a couple of years at least.
Yeah, the big one for me out of this, and I've talked about this a lot, is the integration with the tools. See, the problem with Osquery, back to our previous conversation, is it's an operational tool. It's post-development. It's part of the infrastructure, depending on if you're running your own dedicated servers or not, right? And so that's more of a NetOps, IT ops, maybe DevOps tool, but the developers, they don't have any insight into this, right? And so what advantage does Osquery have for them? Probably not very much. Versus other tools that have to be integrated into the early part of the tool chain that do provide value to the developers during the development process that makes these things more secure when they go into production. And there's a lot of new startups. People ping me all the time. I've had probably a half a dozen conversations in the past couple months, even though I've been traveling and on vacation, of people that are trying to solve the front end of the development process. What tools can I give developers in their IDEs? What plugins and other things can I put right into Jenkins and the build servers? People are really starting to think about the integration, the tool set integration problem in the right way, where it has to be really developer friendly, which I don't think Osquery fits in that bucket, but it's all these other pieces along the way of configuration, of binaries, what software compositions in my stuff, all these things that we can move earlier to the developer side will provide advantages longer term. And so this is still a big area, but people are starting to think about it the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, that idea of what can we do to give the developers more tools, more capabilities within that in that early side of the development. That means then that you can also have your logging focused on quality areas. You either have instrumented your own code or you've instrumented your containers so they're self-reporting. And then maybe this type of aspect, we'll just call it the capability, it's not necessarily generating that terabytes of log data a month because you just don't need that visibility and you don't need to store it. So I'm saying this from that aspect of just that pure engineering. What are the trade-offs in terms of cost of running these tools, both on people as well as time, as well as storage? You're paying for the CPU to do all this as well as the storage.
Yep.
I think too, this other, so that GitHub article they're talking about of things to avoid, I think is a good companion to another article from SD Times that was talking about what do DevOps team structures look like. In other words, it's always easy to say, don't do this, avoid this, don't get hacked, don't have cross-site scripting. It's a little bit more nuanced, and I think it's a more positive approach to also say, here is what a good team design looks like, or here's where the context of a good team design can work in. And it's highlighting that there's another blog that it's linked to from that article that's talking about that difference between siloing a dev team and an ops team, which is one of the reasons we have a DevOps team now. And it calls out things like the SREs, site reliability engineers, which is something that I think it was Google and Netflix have really pushed on that type of role. And that's very much a operations role that's the team running and working with Osquery, but they're also the team trying to figure out how to wrangle Osquery to do what they need it to do. So they're still writing that code. They're still writing some Python. They're writing some plugins to be able to make the tools scale the way they need, or filter on particular instances, or particular data types that they need, or adjust into their tool chains. So I thought this was a pretty cool article as well. It's a bit philosophical, just in kind of like how to think about teams rather than necessarily too practical, but still informative, I think.
Yeah, GitLab covered part of this at KubeCon in Barcelona when I was over there. It was one of the sessions at the SysTick event I emceed for them. And I got to dig into my notes a little deeper, but they definitely talked about the shift of how to model the organizations under a DevOps environment, right? And trying to break down these silos, don't keep these silos in place. And there is going to be a lot of work and activity on figuring out the optimal DevOps organizational structure for various organizations. I think it's still very fluid, kind of influx of what's the right way for these teams to work together. But the ability to break down some of the walls, the ability to integrate security and some of the other teams more tightly together are all things we're going to see continue to evolve to give us a better flow as we try to increase the speed of getting applications out the door. And so these guys have been on the forefront of it. They definitely have some really interesting ideas. How it plays out will be the interesting part, and what kind of variations do we see off of it to really optimize it for an organization based on how they want to drive their DevOps process.
So
Go ahead, John.
As usual, everything Matt says is pretty spot on. GitLab, I mean, we use GitLab at Layered Insight. Big fan of everything those guys are doing. But I think what's actually even better here, that article, the second blog, which are the website, which is linked to in there, the DevOps topologies. Anybody in development management, operations management, or if they happen to be doing DevOps management or SRE management, this page is like gold. You can go and try to get your SREs or your DevOps folks to read the SRE books from O'Reilly. This page is just like, it's so spot on. I've, just looking through it, and like either both internally as well as some of the customers I deal with and just people out on that I run into at shows and stuff, it shows sort of the different, to use the phrase, code smells of like the proper way to do this and the improper way. And like, you just look through and you're like, I've seen companies do that. I've seen companies do that. I've seen companies do that, sort of trying to have a separate DevOps group between ops and dev, all these sort of nasty anti-patterns. I think it's a really great read. If I could, and I probably will print this out and hang it in a few people's cubes. I think it's really well done.
Yeah, and I think, John, to your point, is the way we see operations moving forward is going to be interesting, because we've given the control, a lot more control, to the developers than I think ops was maybe comfortable with in this concept of DevOps. And definitely SEC has concerns in this model as well, don't get me wrong. But think about every single thing from an operational perspective being pretty much done as code, right? Everything we're doing is software defined. It's the developers defining it. How much does ops really play in the environment in some organizations when there is no Kubernetes cluster to manage or anything else, because I'm literally pushing to Fargate or I'm pushing to ACS, AKS? Ops almost doesn't exist in those environments. And when you run through these different patterns, these anti-patterns and the different types of how these teams are going to morph, each organization is going to look at these and go, yeah, we want to look more like that versus that one. We're going to, embed ops and dev and just let dev have the full control. You might put somebody in the middle. That's what I meant by this is going to morph and change based on what the organization's doing. But ops has a really interesting change coming, I think, because the way it works with dev could be very different in different organizations.
So it depends on the org, on the age as well as the size. So I would completely agree with you. If you look at our bubble in Silicon Valley, or probably a lot of people listening to the show, we're really used to, Facebook, Slack, Netflix, any of these big sort of, relatively sexy companies. Yeah, they've cut out a lot of the ops side, and they're able to go really, really nimbly and do those pushes. take a step back and look at a Fortune 500 company. And some of those have done this as well, but a lot of those, they still have data centers with, 200,000-300,000 square feet worth of servers. So now you've got an ops group doing the old stuff. You've got the dev guys, the latest dev guys with new projects trying to push directly into a cloud, some sort of moving in between these two things. And then going back to our previous topic, what I've been seeing is you start running with multiple systems. So we were talking about, oh, come on, brain. We're talking about some of these Osquery and systems like this that are putting out a ton of data. There's one company I'm talking to right now. Let's see, there's a network monitoring platform they use. There's a logging platform they're using. There's an alerting platform for ops, an alerting platform for DevOps. There is a security monitoring platform they're using. There's all this different stuff going on, right? They're trying to go to Amazon, but they need to go to Azure as well because they're a partner of Microsoft and they can't get those guys mad at them. And like when you start looking at this in real world in a large organization, the pieces, the appendages which are hanging off the body that you got to keep attached and somehow sort of keep them moving in the right direction, it starts getting messy. And that's where I think this page becomes really interesting because you see some of those examples of those mixtures. And I think, yeah, in the long run, I'm spot on with you. A question I've been asking folks recently just to sort of get a sense for, and you're talking to network engineers, like what, where do they fall on the spectrum of things? Really simple question. How much automation do you want in here? Would you think about running Puppet on your Cisco's or your Aristas? And the response or the look on their face tells you pretty quickly sort of where they fall in that range, right? And I'm with you. I want to see everything operations as code. But I don't think either everyone's ready for that or they're ready to commit to it. It's pretty scary to do in some ways. So,
agreed. Because think about what the Google outage a few weeks back, right? It was a misconfiguration with a couple of vulnerabilities that took down the entire cloud service, right? So when you push stuff like that as code, it potentially creates some issues, and I think that's still the angst. But we're moving that way. The question is how much control will dev/DevOps get in what was traditional ops in these new environments as they move forward, and what's that change to the operations team look like longer term?
And one of the two pages, Mike, you might remember, actually mentioned one of the use cases they had in there, or one of the, I'll say use cases, was when dev actually takes over too much and runs away with the farm. What happens to the ops guys when they've given away too much control on that? So it's a complex thing. I think we all know the direction we want to move, but how do we sort of get everyone going there in lockstep is the part that's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect that Matt just mentioned briefly too is that we haven't dropped that sec part into here yet either. Mm-hmm. And I don't know necessarily that security has to be, we have a bunch of different Venn diagrams of how that overlap could look. And I think it does depend on the context. What are you building? What are you trying to optimize for? Because we've also seen a lot of good things on that security aspect move into developer responsibilities or that developer domain. We've been repeating quite a bit of just what are the latest, GitHub service that they've released to help developers have, check their library dependencies. GitHub will actually have a bot now, submit pull requests for you to update your libraries. So all these are good basic security types of checks. So I think it's a good challenge to the security team as much as it is that ops team about where are you going to optimize within these types of teams and what should you be focusing on in terms of, I don't know how we could say security as code quite yet, because that's where a lot of the insecurity and the security problems come from is the code. But I think there is an aspect that we can reason about code often much more easily and much both in accuracy and its scale than we can just on a bit of the chaos and randomness of people managing machines, getting command line access to production systems and those types of things.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point. Is the whole sec side of this thing gets really interesting because, again, security gets bifurcated. There's the development side of security, which is secure code, secure configuration, all the things that you can try to do up front to secure code. Then you've got the operational side of security, which is traditionally on the ops side. And as ops moves, what happens to all those logging, incident response, threat hunting, stuff on the operational side in the long haul. Security really needs to figure out where they fit in some of these diagrams, because it will, I think, help them start to really figure out how they become strategic to these teams in the future. But there's a lot of people sitting on kind of the ops side of these models where I see the biggest change coming, and security's got to figure out where they want to be in these new models.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that capability, that last part you were saying too, is that idea of how can the security or the DevSecOps team, or maybe just that security ops team, how can they focus on a capability for the others? And like something like threat hunting probably is a good example of that. But I know even when I have discussions from a product security perspective, we're usually focused on what are you building and what could go wrong. We try to pull in a lot of privacy concerns as well. So I think security and privacy, those are probably there's a Venn diagram there that's starting to merge a bit more, I think, that should. But typically, we're not asking those questions on the incident response side, or, how are you building your system to be robust enough for logging? Or can we do, how immutable is it? How can it help from a forensics perspective? So there still are some areas for security, obviously, I think there's a need for. I think possibly it's that conversation about where to refocus, and where do we also just give up and say, a lot of these old types of old school security awareness programs about here's what the top OWASP top 10 looks like, or here is a particular scanner of some sort. Maybe a lot of those haven't, for the last 20 years, haven't been working as well as they could have. And maybe it's time to admit that and move on to what the developers are doing and optimize for their IDEs and for their environments.
Agreed.
Well, maybe that's maybe we'll take that and use that to segue into a short conversation, or maybe a deep dive conversation into API security. So thanks everyone for joining us on the news, and we'll take a break and return on our topic of the week.